Firearms fury. As survivors of the deadly school shooting in Florida call for action, lawmakers discuss our nation's gun laws. ISIS strikes. The terror group claims responsibility for an attack on an Orthodox church in Russia. Protecting children. The Vatican revives its commission on preventing clergy sex abuse. And balancing act. On President's Day, we discuss the role faith should play for Catholic politicians. On EWTN News Nightly for Monday, February 19th, 2018. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you for joining us for news from a Catholic perspective on this President's Day. I'm Wyatt Goolsby, in for Lauren Ashburn. Calls for change across the country after Wednesday's fatal shooting at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Florida. Now, students are taking action. Students in Parkland, Florida are mourning the 17 people killed last week in a shooting rampage, and they've got a message for lawmakers: never again.
It's time for us to stand up and take action and hold our elected officials responsible.
Later this week, a group is heading to Tallahassee to speak with state legislatures, and a town hall meeting is scheduled Wednesday with Florida Senators Marco Rubio and Bill Nelson among those who have accepted invitations. The main message: address gun reform now.
We're going to be facing this with trepidation and determination, and we have an incredible support system around us, and we are going to be the difference.
This movement already has events set for next month. On March 14th, organizers of the Women's March will have a national school walkout to protest gun violence. 10 days later, there'll be a march on Washington, D.C., where these students, some who aren't old enough to vote, will push for stronger gun legislation.
We are losing our lives while the adults are playing around.
Several survivors have criticized President Trump. Now the White House says he will hold a listening session with students this week. The president is also showing support for attempts to improve the federal background check system. White House correspondent Mark Irons reports. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Wyatt. The president backs the effort behind a bipartisan bill that would penalize federal agencies that fail to provide background records. But today, outside the White House, protesters are calling for more to be done.
More than anything, we just want the politicians to know that they have to do something because they're the voice of the people.
Eleanor Nectarline, a junior in high school, joined by dozens of students today laying down in protest, remembering those who were gunned down in a Florida school.
I decided that it's finally time to do something myself because none of the politicians seem to be doing anything about it.
The protest in front of the White House came as President Trump wrapped up the long weekend at his Mar-a-Lago resort after visiting shooting victims and first responders in Broward County, Florida on Friday.
The job the doctors did, the nurses, the hospital, first responders, law enforcement, really incredible.
The question remains, how will the president, who enjoys strong support from the National Rifle Association, respond to all the gun violence? So far, he's signaled for upgrades to the federal background check database and the need to make sure those suffering with mental illness can't get a gun. This protester is calling for mandatory gun insurance for gun owners and a ban on bump stocks.
We want our Congress to recognize that this is a public health issue.
But past efforts to find solutions have caused fighting along partisan lines, and President Trump is already pointing fingers, tweeting, just like they don't want to solve the DACA problem, why didn't the Democrats pass gun control legislation when they had both the House and Senate during the Obama administration? Because they didn't want to. And now they just talk. In another tweet, the president blamed the FBI, saying they missed signals given by the Florida school shooter that he was going to carry out an attack. The president said the FBI has spent too much time trying to prove his campaign colluded with Russia and needs to get back to basics. Wyatt.
White House correspondent Mark Irons reporting. Thanks, Mark. Congress is facing pressure to pass tougher restrictions on buying guns. Our team coverage turns to Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi. Good evening, Jason.
Good evening, Wyatt. In general, Democrats are calling for stricter gun laws, and GOP says that's not going to prevent future shootings. But some gun control activists are targeting certain members of the GOP, like Florida Republican Marco Rubio.
According to OpenSecrets.org, the NRA donated close to $10,000 to Marco Rubio's 2016 Senate re-election. Rubio supports the Second Amendment's right to bear arms, but he says Congress needs to act.
There's something that came even before the Second Amendment. It's the preamble, and it says that the purpose of the Constitution, and therefore our government, is to ensure the domestic tranquility and the general welfare. And these mass killings are a threat to our general welfare and our domestic tranquility.
I ask for a moment of silence for the victims of the shooting in Florida.
Without objection.
Florida's other Senator Bill Nelson is pushing a ban on assault weapons, like the AR-15 used in this shooting.
At some point, we as a society have got to come together and put a stop to this.
Other senators say Congress must improve background checks and invest in mental health services.
It is so clear that anyone who would shoot children is mentally ill and needs help.
But Ohio's Governor John Kasich is not optimistic that Congress will get anything done on this issue.
Do I think they can do anything on guns? I hope they prove me wrong, and they can, because I have no confidence in them.
Conservative columnist Peggy Noonan says gun laws are only part of the story. She says the bigger issue is a widespread disregard for all human life. But Noonan has a suggestion for Democrats and Republicans, a compromise. She says trade a ban on assault weapons for a ban on late-term abortions. Wyatt, she says, in both instances, the lives of children would be saved.
Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi reporting. Thanks, Jason. Top Russian and American officials trade slights following the indictment of 13 Russians accused of trying to disrupt the 2016 presidential election. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov dismisses the indictments. Speaking in Germany, he says the FBI revelation was, quote, just blabber, and adds, I have no response. Minutes later at the same conference, H.R. McMaster, President Trump's national security advisor, says the evidence of Russian meddling is beyond doubt. He adds the U.S. is getting better at figuring out which country foreign spies come from. ISIS claims responsibility for a deadly attack on churchgoers in a Muslim region in Russia. The shooting in Dagestan left 5 dead and 4 injured. Police say a lone gunman began open fire using a hunting rifle as people left a Russian Orthodox church. That gunman was shot and killed at the scene. At least 27 are dead after Islamic State militants ambush a group of Shiite fighters in Iraq. The attack comes more than 2 months after Baghdad declared victory over the extremist group. The leader of one of the most prominent Shiite militias says the war against terrorism is not over yet. More than 200 people pray while marching in silence after an attack on a Catholic church in Bangladesh. The group was protesting looting and the desecration of communion hosts at the Canterbury St. Augustine Church in Dhaka. Many participants wore black as a sign of mourning. Police have not made any arrests so far in the attacks. 65 people are dead following a plane crash in a remote part of southern Iran. The twin-engine turboprop went down in foggy weather. Search teams reached the site before dawn after Russia helped them find the crash site. Russia and Iran are close military allies. A volcano in Indonesia erupts, sending ash more than 16,000 feet into the air. Officials say no one was injured, but the Regional Volcanic Ash Advisory Center in Australia issues a red notice to airlines. Mount Sinabung has been dormant for centuries. It erupted in 2010, 2014, and again 2 years ago. Pope Francis backs down and accepts the resignation of a Nigerian bishop who had been rejected for years by priests of his diocese. Edward Penton, Rome correspondent for EWTN's National Catholic Register, joins us. Edward, what are the reasons the Vatican gave for the Pope accepting Bishop Peter Akpaleke's resignation?
Well, the bishop wrote a pastoral letter on Ash Wednesday, basically saying that he didn't think it was beneficial for him to stay as bishop of the diocese because of this opposition from priests, and also because the Pope's appeal to the priests was heeded as far as the Pope was concerned, in the sense that they wrote to him repenting of their rejection of this bishop.
So what exactly did the priests in his diocese reject in him, or what was it about him?
Well, it's really because he was an outsider appointed by Benedict XVI in 2012. He was considered to be part of a sort of general conspiracy by the leadership in the Church of Nigeria against this tribe in the diocese, linguistic tribe. And they felt that it was just another part of a conspiracy of oppression against this tribe.
Well, today's announcement comes after Pope Francis in June issued a harsh ultimatum to the priests in the diocese. What was the ultimatum and why was it considered so strong?
Well, the ultimatum really was to ask for total obedience from the priests to the Pope for his appointments, in this appointment in particular. And he asked them to write a letter to him within 30 days saying that they were pledging fidelity and obedience to the Pope about this and repenting of rejecting the bishop. And it was so strong really because he felt it was a scandal to the church that such disobedience would be made public. And he really wanted that put right.
It's not very often you hear about such kind of ultimatums from the Pope on this. What kind of implications do you think this could have for the future?
Well, it's interesting that it comes at this time because there's a lot of pressure, as many viewers will know, against rather pressure on the Pope to force the resignation of Bishop Barros in Chile, who's been accused of witnessing sexual abuse. So this case is really being used perhaps by some as saying that the Pope's authority is being challenged, and that if you do challenge it, he may succumb to accepting pressure to have the resignation of a bishop, in this case Bishop Barros. So it could set a precedent in that sense.
Okay, we'll continue to be watching to see if it does and if this happens in any other parts of the world. Edward Penton, Rome correspondent for EWTN's National Catholic Register, thanks so much.
Thanks, Wyatt.
A key victim in the Chilean sex abuse scandal says he feels his story finally has been heard after meeting with a Vatican investigator over the weekend.
We'll see what the outcome is of all this, but I feel that Monsignor Scicluna is a very good man, and I think he was sincerely moved by what I was saying.
Archbishop Charles Scicluna met with Juan Carlos Cruz on Saturday in New York for more than 3 hours. Scicluna is investigating accusations against Bishop Juan Barros of covering up abuse by priests in Chile. Meantime, at the Vatican, Pope Francis has revived the Sex Abuse Advisory Commission by naming new members.
The Commission has done a lot of work of education with bishops' conferences around the world, and the Commission's here to serve the Church, but I wouldn't say only the Church. I would say society as well. You know, there are a lot of people who need healing from abuse, sexual abuse, but everybody needs protection.
The Holy Father named 9 new members of the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors. He also kept 7 from the initial group. The Vatican says survivors of abuse are included. Pope Francis and Vatican administrators are taking part in a week-long retreat outside Rome. At the retreat today, the theme was Jesus wants to quench our thirst. It focused on the Lord as the water of life, and his love for us is unconditional, even though he knows that we are still incomplete and under construction. Coming up, Counterculture. A pro-life group in Ohio begins a new ad campaign. And Dating Guru. A professor at Boston College has some advice for singles. The United States drops out of the top 5 at the Olympics. Norway continues to lead with 28 medals total. Germany has 20, Canada 17, Netherlands 13, and the Olympic athletes from Russia 11. The United States is in 6th with 10. Welcome back. I'm Wyatt Goolsby in for Lauren Ashburn. Ohio's largest abortion clinic launches an ad campaign aimed at challenging the stigma around abortion. 16 billboards in Cleveland display a sentence beginning with abortion is and ending with a different phrase, including abortion is a blessing and abortion is a family value. But pro-lifers in the state are launching a campaign of their own. Joining us now via Skype is Molly Smith, president of Cleveland Right to Life. Molly, last week your group put up 11 billboards across Cleveland with a very different message than the pro-abortion people. What does your campaign focus on and what kind of reaction are you getting?
You know, what we've focused on is to try to use this as an opportunity to educate the area, particularly African American community. What we've discovered is that this particular campaign by Preterm has focused almost exclusively on the African American population within the Cleveland area. As you probably all know and your listeners know, the African American community are very, very badly affected by the abortion industry. Unfortunately, what has happened is that the billboard company, Lamar, which is a national billboard company, has censored many of our messages. So we have only been able to put up 5 messages on those 11 billboards. We've been able to say abortion is a population control, abortion is fake feminism, abortion is lost fatherhood, and abortion is regret, and abortion is big business. The ones that were not allowed to go onto the billboard company that the Lamar corporate censored from us was abortion is exploitation. Abortion is injustice everywhere. Abortion is racism. They said, absolutely not, we're not going to put that up. So it's been a battle to get these billboards.
Yes, sure. So why do you think it was that you guys had so much difficulty launching your billboard campaign when the pro-abortion people didn't seem to have that same problem?
You know, at the beginning, we felt that it might be because the billboard company did not want to get involved in any kind of a racist, battle going on between 2 different groups. However, the longer we dealt with Lamar, the more we've become absolutely convinced that they are absolutely censoring our message. And the reason why we have that is because we had to provide them with 4 different URLs that would go up on the bottom of the billboards. And first of all, we started off with abortion is some Black Lives Matter. They said absolutely not, they're not putting up that URL. We then offered which Black Lives Matter as a URL and when do Black Lives Matter. They would not put those up either. So we eventually had to come up with what abortion really is. And that one was accepted. This company seems to be censoring the pro-life message here, which is outrageous, totally outrageous, and has been seen so by the Black community here in the Cleveland area. We have had National Action Network has joined us. NAACP Women's Chair has come on board with us. Black on Black Crime in the area has joined with us to protest this. And Peace in the Hood, which is a Muslim group, has also said this is outrageous.
Well, it sounds like a worthwhile campaign, and know that we will continue to pray for you guys and your message. Molly Smith, president of Cleveland Right to Life, thanks so much for talking with us about it.
You're quite welcome, and we really appreciate the prayers.
A recent study shows only 49% of adults in the U.S. between the ages of 18 and 64 are currently married, an all-time low. Marriage rates for young adults are dropping, but those for older adults have increased over the past 50 years. 2 Christian companies and a professor at a Jesuit college are part of a new documentary on dating.
There's like single, married, and then there's extra single, and that's the one that I would check off.
The Dating Project is part how-to guide and part real-life look at 5 singles looking for true love. Most of the 5 end up talking about their faith and the role it plays in their search. One of the producers says even in the Christian world, in dating and relationships, we're just as lost as anyone else. Up next, keeping the faith.
And we shall win.
On President's Day, we discuss the legacy of our only Catholic president and how Catholics shape public debate more than half a century later. And most likely to succeed, trying to solve a World War II mystery with a Catholic high school yearbook. President Trump tweets a short message today. Have a great but very reflective President's Day. Welcome back. I'm Wyatt Goolsby in for Lauren Ashburn. Today we honor George Washington, our first president, who was born on February 22nd, 1732. Since the founding of the nation, there has been only one Catholic president, John F. Kennedy, a Democrat elected in 1960. He and his wife Jackie are now icons in American culture. Their daughter Caroline was baptized by Cardinal Richard Cushing of Boston. Americans enjoyed watching their young family grow in the White House. Electing a Catholic president was unthinkable up until that point in the United States. We're joined by Dr. Matthew Bunson, an EWTN senior contributor. So Matthew, how significant historically was the election of President Kennedy and his Catholic faith?
Well, as you just said, it was essentially unthinkable in 1960 that a president could be elected. Just 40 years before that, Al Smith in the 1928 election, a Catholic, had run and was demolished by Herbert Hoover. But that was a campaign, A, because of a good economy, but also because he was Catholic. That the turnout against Al Smith, simply because he was Catholic, was a decisive point in that election. In Kennedy's election, Kennedy barely won the presidency, as we know. He won by about 100,000 votes. Part of it was because he got 80% of the Catholic vote in 1960, but there was also a backlash. A lot of people just were not comfortable and unwilling to vote for a Catholic in the White House.
And of course, So much has changed now.
It has. Kennedy's election sort of cleared the way for Catholics to assimilate into modern American life. That has brought with it peril, however, because as we've seen with a lot of Catholic politicians, as we've seen with Catholic voters, we've lost much of our Catholic identity as voters, and now Catholic vote tends to parallel the rest of the country.
Well, maybe that sort of touches on my next question here. Why do you think it is that we've not seen another Catholic president since Kennedy?
Yeah, well, precisely for those reasons. Catholics tend to vote like everyone else in the American voting populace. We've also had sort of an internal fight over Catholic candidates. The one most recent, of course, in 2004, John Kerry, Senator Kerry, narrowly lost winning against George W. Bush. Had he carried Ohio, and he lost by only 80,000 votes, he would have been elected. But the Catholic support for him was very narrow. It was about 52 to 48 in favor of Kerry, with many, many Catholics voting against him precisely because of his stand on issues like pro-life and euthanasia.
Let's turn to Congress now. About 1/3 of the Senate, about 1/4 of the House is Catholic. How do you think Catholic politicians in general have shaped public policy?
Well, as we saw with John Kerry, it can cut both ways. You have a lot of Catholic politicians who use their Catholic faith to inform how to make prudential judgments, to bring with them a certain moral coherence. We also have a lot of Catholic politicians, as we just saw recently with the vote against partial birth abortion, who set aside the Catholic teachings that they publicly espouse and voted against things like the life movement. So in public policy, in crafting public policy, it can really cut both ways.
One representative, Steve Scalise, the House Majority Whip, spoke at the National Prayer Breakfast. I want to listen to him because he mentioned his faith specifically.
I'm a Catholic. We have people of all faiths. This idea that you could just check your faith at the door. People would say, you know, when you're voting on issues, you know, how do you separate your faith from the way you vote? The faith is part of who you are. It's part of who I am.
He raises a good point about the idea of how can you separate your faith from how you're voting. How do you think faith plays into how they should view some of these issues in terms of their public policy?
Well, you have to be very careful about a kind of schizophrenia that on the one hand you say in private, I'm this, in public, I'm this. So we've seen that with a lot of Catholic politicians, especially on the issue of abortion. One of the things to remember is that as Catholics we have a privilege, we have a right to use our Catholic faith to make an informed decision about prudential judgments, but also to form our consciences, to bring into the public square moral coherence in how we approach issues. In other words, we bring the basic raw material of moral decision-making into what are supposed to be policies that help the dignity of the human person and strive for the common good. That's one of the tasks for any Catholic politician, and it's their right and their privilege, as I said, and we just saw Representative Scalise make that point very finely.
Such important issues, and like I said, not every politician remembers to vote in that way. Matthew Bunson, EWTN senior contributor, thanks so much.
Great to be with you.
Pope Francis says Blessed Pope Paul VI will be made a saint this year. The Holy Father confirmed the news during his annual Lenten meeting with the priests of Rome last week. He jokingly also told them, Benedict and I are on the waiting list. Pray for us. A second miracle attributed to Paul VI was approved by the Vatican earlier this month. And finally tonight, a photo from a Catholic high school yearbook begins a search more than 70 years in the making. 3 of the 4 servicemen who graduated from Central Catholic High near Albany, New York, survived World War II. Navy pilot John McGrath, second from the left, died in a plane crash. Now, thanks to new technology, the families have begun to search for the crash site and his body. This plane can be found, says one World War II researcher. And it's amazing how photos decades old can unite veterans and their families. We wish them the best of luck in their search. And that wraps up our newscast for tonight. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Wyatt Goolsby. We'll be back tomorrow with more news from a Catholic perspective. Good night, and God bless.